Hi, I'm Ray Lauk, and I'm the business manager of the Maywood School District outside of Chicago, and I've been doing some adjunct teaching where I teach school finance. And I was talking to Betty about how I do my school finance budget presentations. And so she asked me to share those with you, and since I'm not available to Skype with you or be there in person, we're going to do this by video. But think about how you communicate best with family and friends. When you get together with someone, you're at a bar or a house, wherever, you're not showing PowerPoints with bar graphs and 60 slides. You're just not doing that because that's not how human beings communicate and connect with each other. The way we communicate as human beings is through stories. And so whenever I tell my budget presentation each year for the Board of Education, I always tell them, think of this school budget as a story. And it's gotten that they're so used to it, they tease me because they say, oh, Ray, what is it time for our budget story yet? But it makes a difference because it makes it accessible. It makes it comprehensible. When you look at the budget document, in Illinois, it's like a 36-page document that the State Board of Education gives us, plus all the backup documentation. It's a stack an inch thick or more. Completely incomprehensible to the average person. But yet, if you start to think of the school budget as a story, it makes it it makes it easier to understand, and people get it. Because what the budget is the story of a community's hopes, dreams, and aspirations for its children. It's that simple. It is nothing more complex than that. Now, while this isn't an overview of school finance or the budgeting process, think of the budget in terms of different parts of the story. Maybe as different chapters in the story, or as a beginning, middle, and end of the story. Think of it that way. As the beginning part of the story, well, every budget starts with beginning fund balances. That is, at the start of your fiscal year on July 1st, what do you have sitting in the bank? That's the beginning part of the story. And then, as you go through the year, the story continues, and you've got revenues. And you typically have three types of revenues: state, local, and federal. Regardless of which state you're in, it's three types of revenues. And you've got your expenditures, where you're spending money, and then your ending fund balance on June 30th. The end of the year, what's left in the bank. So let's talk about each one of those parts and see how they contribute to the story of your school district. So we start with the fund balances. We've got July 1st beginning fund balance and June 30 ending fund balance. Something goes on during that time. Money comes in and money goes out. If you're spending more money than you're taking in, you're running a deficit. Just like in our normal households. If you have $50,000 and you're spending $60,000 a year with credit cards and whatever, other types of debt, you're running a deficit. You're spending more than you are taking in. So that's a story. Now, most districts are probably trying to build surpluses where you're spending less than you're taking in. So if you're earning $50,000 in your household and you spend $40,000, you're running a surplus. You're building $10,000 each year to your bank account, to your fund balances. Same thing with school districts. If you're trying to build up those reserves, because at least in Illinois, we have great uncertainty from the state. For a while, we had 2 years without a state budget. They were late making payments to us. So we had to have that cushion because teachers still expected to get paid. The lights had to be kept on. Books had to be bought. So you've got to have that surplus, that cushion. So maybe that's your story. Maybe that's part of your story. Maybe the story is that the school district is trying to build up reserves for uncertainties, for times of uncertainty. If the state is, playing games with your funding, if you have property taxes and the property wealth is uncertain, like after 2008 in the housing crash, everyone's wealth went down, property wealth went down. Well, every state's a little different in terms of how we generate money, but you have to figure out that's part of your story. What is your story relative to your ending fund balances? Are you trying to build up a surplus for the future to cover times of uncertainty, so that if there's a period of time when you don't get property tax money or you don't get other revenues like state aid, general state aid, you want to be able to pay your bills. If you don't have the money in the bank, then you've got to go to the bank and start borrowing money. And then there's a cost of debt involved. And so having that surplus gives you that cushion. Some people call it a rainy day fund. It allows you to be able to ride out those bumps that we have in school finance. So that might be part of your story. But look at your revenues, state, local, and federal. In Illinois, and it's not uncommon across the country, there's the balance. Property poor districts receive greater general state aid from their state because they have less ability to generate property taxes themselves. High wealth school districts receive very little from the state because they don't need it. They have that capacity to tax themselves from the property base. And so that may be part of your story. If your property tax base is going down because of the housing market, that may be the story. If it's rising, that may be part of your story too. So where you get your revenues and that ratio between state and local funding is part of the story because it's a reflection of the wealth of the district and the district's ability to generate revenues for itself. Certainly the federal revenues, you look at that and there's a story. I always tell my students, if you see as a percentage of the revenues are coming from the federal government represent more than 8, 9, 10%, then it tells you something's going on there. And it may be that there's high populations of second language learners, high special ed populations, high numbers of poverty, students living in poverty, because the federal money, of course, comes for very targeted, specific purposes, where the state just basically gives you a pot of money and says, spend it. Your property tax money comes for certain categories, probably in Texas. In Illinois, certainly it's that way. But the federal money is for very specific, targeted purposes. So if your budget is the percentage of money coming from the federal government, the percentage of your revenues coming from the federal government is over 10%, that as a rule of thumb tells you you've got students with high need. And that's part of your story. Now, perhaps the part of the budget that explains the bulk of your story is in your expenditures. Because your revenues, you really have very little control over that. You can maximize what you're entitled to from each of those sources, state, local, and federal, but you're not going out and selling lemonade on the street. So you really aren't, I mean, you may be doing some rental of properties, renting out to churches or whatever to use the gym or the community groups, but it's a drop in the bucket. So generally, we're not able to generate revenue in an entrepreneurial way in any meaningful sense. But in the area of expenditures, that's where it tells you what's important to the district. Because what you want to do is see that your priorities are aligned with the money and that you put your money back to the priorities. So by doing that, you can see where you're spending the money and you can infer that is where your priorities lie, or the priorities of the district lie. If not, then there are bigger problems there if you're spending money on things that are not the highest priority. So I hope that makes sense. But when you're telling the story, where are you spending your money on? Is it bilingual education? Is it STEM programs? Is it gifted and talented? Is it outdoor education? Whatever it is. Those are your priorities, and that's the story. What is most important to you and to the district? Because that's where you put your money. That's where you put dollars. If you're not putting dollars there, it ain't important. I'm just telling you. So how do you tell this story? And the way that you tell the story is by being very specific. Find specific situations, instances, success stories. If you can make people, your listener, cry, that's even better. If it's a heartwarming story, you've got a student in a bilingual program who came in speaking only English, and now after 2 years or 3 years, they can speak like they grew up in another country. Their language skills are that good. If you have pictures of artwork that they've done, very specific situations, specific stories of children, telling that story so that the Board of Education, the community, can better understand and better feel that they're getting their money's worth. Because that's the proof right there. When they see that kids are succeeding, individual kids, not 600 kids at the second grade level, at grade level. That's boring. That's just, who cares? But tell me about a single student, Michael, who did X, Y, and Z, who won the robotics competition and went off to Washington or whatever. Find very specific situations so that the Board of Education, you may have graphs and bar graphs and charts. You can't get totally away from that. But once you've got that, give it meaning. And the way you give it meaning is by showing how it affects kids. And by kids, is using one specific example to illustrate the impact of their investments. So, school district budget is a story. It's a story of a community's hopes, dreams, and aspirations for its children. And it does that, it tells that story through the change in your beginning and ending fund balances, July 1 to June 30. It tells the story through the revenues and how that ratio between state and local funding is, because it's a reflection of wealth of the community, of the property in the community. And then the expenditures, because you put your money where your mouth is. You put your money behind the programs that are priorities, that are important to you, to the district. And you give specific examples, specific stories about a child or a classroom or something that they've done to illustrate where that money's going to and the success that that's generating. I hope this makes sense to you. If you have any questions, Betty knows how to get back to me, and I would be happy to answer any other questions. Again, I'm Ray Lauk, and actually, so my email is rlauk@rlauk.com. rlauk@rlauk.com. So good luck with your school finance presentations. Thanks. Bye.